Good evening, friends, and thank you for tuning in with us again. We are continuing our study here in the book of Philippians, and we are in chapter 3. If you all were following along with us for our last class, we cut off about midway through because we did not want to go on for an additional hour like we have done in previous lessons. So we thought we would spare you with just, I think we were 40 or 45 or maybe, 50 minutes. I don't have clocks that work, I think, when we do these things. So thank you for being here with us. Thank you for tuning in. Michael, how's everything in Somerset tonight?
We warned everyone that these were just going to be just like listening in on the conversations that we have anyway. And I think both our wives would attest that those are time insensitive most of the time anyway. So I think we're just living up to our billing here. Everything is great. Thank you for asking. Green was a solid choice tonight on the shirts. I think we're primed. I think we're ready for this.
Yeah, and my wife has commented that I always end up in T-shirts and you're in collared shirts. So there's one of us that looks professional in this at least. I don't know how much we sound professional. At least one of us looks professional.
I've got a face for radio, so that's where I thrive.
Well, again, thank you all. I've gotten a bunch of calls, texts, messages, comments on Facebook. We really appreciate you all joining in the ride for this. As we said in the early disclaimer, this is just kind of how we work. We're going to study and bounce some stuff back off of one another. If this is your first time tuning in, what you're in for is just a little back and forth of our parsing through scriptures and trying to take what we can out of here. Asking each other, this is not a verse-by-verse study. We're honestly asking each other the questions we would come up with if we were studying this. Hey, what do you think about this part, or what do you think about that part? We're going to continue doing that a little bit tonight. So with that in mind, Michael, I think you had a question there in 12, and I think my next one didn't pick up for a couple of verses.
Yeah, so, as we pick up in 12, and I think you described this very well, these are sincerely questions that we are texting each other after we reread the passage and say, let's talk about this because this is genuinely a question. And so one that struck me in verse 12, and I'm going to go back to the English Standard tonight. It says, not that I have...
It's very disappointed in you.
I don't have my iPad with me. That's right. It's my net. I'll get my net fixed later. But it's not that I've already obtained this or I'm already perfect. So I haven't got this yet. There's a little divine dissatisfaction, right? We're not where we need to be just yet. But I press on to make it my own. Verse 13, brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own. And so what is it? Not that I've already obtained this, but I press on to make it, as if he's referring to something he's already talked about. I press on to make it my own. And so, you go back and read some of the previous verses and things we read last time. Well, verse 11, that any means possible, I may obtain resurrection from the dead. I think clearly that's not it.
Right.
that wouldn't make any sense. So that's not what he's trying to obtain. And so what is it? What is this thing that he knows that he hasn't obtained, and then he hasn't made it his own, but he's pressing on to obtain it? And is there a reference for it, or is it more just a general comment?
No, that's a great question here. And this is one where context is important. So in my English Standard Version, I think this is the Study Bible, I've got a paragraph break here that in my Bible it says this part is about straining towards the goal.
Yes.
Now, again, sometimes we read down to those margin notes, paragraph breaks, and we think, all right, he was done in verse 11 talking about what he was talking about, but he's not. This is still very much a continuation on what we were talking about last week. And I think it's also important to look at all of what he says here in 12 and into 13. So not that I've already obtained this or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. And I think when you look at that with the verses right before, if we would have just, if you all remember from one of our studies, I think maybe it was in chapter 1 or the intro, we talked about if you just strip the verses out and read this as a letter, I think this makes more sense here. That what he's talking about here is by any means possible, he can attain the resurrection of the dead. Well, what does that mean? It's not just the bodily resurrection, right? He's not looking. What he's saying is, I want to see Jesus face to face. I want to get to heaven. I want to walk through that door. This is similar language, I think, to what he's going to write later when he talks to Timothy at the end of his life, that I've been poured out as a drink offering. I'm ready. I've run the course. I've finished the race. This is before that. He's still running. He's still trying to finish the race in Philippians, that he tells Timothy, I'm dying in a couple of days. They're taking me out back, but I'm ready for it. He's not ready here. He's still got much more to do. As he said in chapter 1, right, that for me to go on to be with Christ is far better, but I'm here for your sakes, right? So he's still got work to do for the Philippians, for others, and he's straining towards that ultimate salvation. Hebrew writer talks about it when the faith becomes sight. And friends, that's really what we're all working for, right? It's when this faith, when everything we've been working for finally becomes sight, and we don't have possession of it here. We get and that's the beautiful thing about this, and I don't want to get too tangent-y here, but we get glimpses of it here. We get such like beautiful little glimpses of it here. And sometimes like I see that glimpse of it when we're having a singing. And like Southside's done some fabulous singings over the years. And when you're in a building with 300, 500, how many ever people, and it's one heart and one voice, and it's all praising to God, I can close my eyes and see that throne scene in Revelation, right? Where it is all Christians of all time from all dispensations raising their voice to God in continual praise. And that just, I mean, it gives me chills every time. And I think that's the glimpse, right, that we get into heaven. And sometimes it's in a particular service where everything is just meshing and wonderful together. And we kind of get that, wow, like this is what I'm longing for. So we get those glimpses here, but that Paul's talking about, I'm trying to get to that goal, and I'm still striving towards it. So I'll throw it back at you. What do you think? I mean,
I'm going to take your tangent and go tangent off your tangent, but I think there's another point there. I think you're exactly right that, you know, when we are spirit infested, that we do get glimpses of what eternity is. And I also think that the reverse side of that is when we are world infested, we get glimpses of what our eternity is. You know, those deep moments of despair and anxiety and panic and loneliness, that those are also glimpses. So anyway, I think that works both ways. Anyway, just a side point there that I think is important and interesting, especially when you see people in that condition. This is a divine warning shot here, that you're getting a glimpse of eternity in the state of worldliness. But the point I would make, just I think we're making the same point, but just making it a different way, is there a chance that he's referring to in verse 12 goes back to verse 10, where he says that I may know him, the power of his resurrection, share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. Becoming like him in his death. You know, the easy answer there, I think, would be, well, that's a baptism reference, like him in his death, baptism, and I think that's perfectly appropriate. But you know, we know for Paul that baptism now was 2 decades ago. You know, it was some time ago. At the time he's writing this in Roman prison, in quarantine, as we have said.
House arrest.
So yeah, and so. I'm persuaded that when he says becoming like him in his death, that he's not talking about being baptized again, but rather the sacrifice and the complete lack of self and the love and the grace that Jesus showed in his death was what Paul was like. That was the benchmark that he was trying to attain. And so if that is the and it goes right along with what you're saying, that it's a heavenly bar. And it fits a little bit with what Jesus was saying, that it's a righteousness that wasn't his own, a righteousness that you know, and so we covered that in last class, that he may find a righteousness which is not his own, verse 9, but one through faith in Christ that comes through God. And so that level of love and faithfulness that Jesus showed on the cross was perhaps something that Paul felt that perhaps what he thought he was reaching for, that he hadn't obtained it, becoming like him in his death, that's what he hadn't obtained because he was not made perfect.
So this is the first time in our study that we've hit one of these, but I'm kind of glad we're here tonight. So that's that's something I honestly hadn't thought about. So let's kind of think through that. So in my mind, it's, if we're going down that route, then are we looking at like the 7 statements of Jesus on the cross? Are we talking about the level of selflessness that it takes to say, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing? Is it the selflessness that looks at John and says, you know, woman, behold your son and behold your mother, that he's thinking about others while in deep agonizing pain? Is it that selflessness that finally even calls it's finished, and not meaning his life, but meaning the entire gospel plan that him and God set in foundation before the foundation of the world, that they had set all of this in motion, that right now, you know, this is done. So are we talking about that level of spirituality?
Yeah, and I would add to that, what about even in the midst of that agony, so that scripture may be fulfilled, saying, I thirst, right? And I think that fits right in with what you're saying, that in the midst of where it would have been the most acceptable to have human emotions, to think, I didn't deserve this. I am suffering this. I am in agony. When it would have been the most understandable to focus on himself, that Jesus was thinking about the thief, and thinking about those who forgive them for they don't know what they do. He was thinking about scripture being fulfilled. He was thinking about his mother. So if that is the, if Paul had that in mind, then this great verse in my mind becomes even more meaningful.
That's the bar, right?
Correct.
And even the Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, the my God, why have you forsaken me? And we could, tonight's not the night to have that discussion. We can get into all the things that meant, but the quick is what he was saying was, he was quoting a psalm, right?
Yes.
He wasn't the
divine flashing arrow. Yeah. Divine flashing arrow of the Psalms.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. He wasn't, people sometimes will take that and want to talk about the phrase, but what he was saying was similar to like you and I would quote, all right, Philippians chapter 3, verse 15. When you recite the first line of the Psalm, you are drawing everyone's attention. And in a day and time that you don't have Bibles, you don't have scrolls for the masses, they memorized those Psalms. They memorized those writings. And so Jesus is saying, this is that. Like, this is what's happening right now. So even from a moment, to your point there, and I'm just kind of thinking through all this stuff at the same time, is, so from a moment of, and this fits into where Paul's at here too, when a moment where it would be easy to be selfish, you're being selfless. You're taking that opportunity to teach because it's a golden opportunity where you should be flying in the face of this and being selfish. You're saying, let me think about this crowd. Let me think about what I can do. And if I can take one more shot at them, one more opportunity to get them to see. And I think that goes a long way in setting the stage right for Acts chapter 2. Because it's, as they realize all these things on the day of Pentecost, as Peter's retelling this story, it's got to be those that were in the crowd are, hey, wait a minute. What about this? And what about this? And what about this? And start putting that puzzle together, maybe for the first time ever.
You think about the grace that it takes to say, this is a point that's been made 1,000 times, but you think about the grace that it takes to say, forgive them, they know not what they do, instead of, you guys will see, you guys will get what's coming. And if Paul had to summon that many, many times when his own brethren persecuted him and threatened to kill him, wanted to kill him, plotted to kill him, and instead of, hey, you guys will see, had to keep that attitude of keep going back, keep hammering, because every time 98 hate me, 2 listen, and if I can keep batting 2% out of 100, I'll accept that. I'll keep rolling forward with that, and so. And in some ways, you read verse 12 through 14, and it can be obviously very encouraging. Even in the situation he's in, he keeps moving on. He doesn't relent. Keeps moving forward. He keeps pressing on. And I think it's beautiful language here. Maybe some of my favorite language of Paul. On the other hand, it can be a little daunting to think that the Apostle Paul says, I don't have it. I still got to strain for it. I still got to move forward. But if we are dividing rightly here, and perhaps what he does have in mind is that level of Jesus, I can swallow that. I can accept that a little better. Yeah, Paul hadn't gotten there. That is the bar. We are going to be imperfect. That level of holiness is our righteousness is filthy rags, right? If that's the comp.
Well, and I think this is also significant here that we can take from that, because I think that's an excellent point, is that along our growth chart, bell curve of faith, right, that we reach milestones, but are we then raising that bar up again? Because I think that's exactly what Paul's doing here. And he's, hey, I got to X. Now I want to go to Y. And then I want to go to Y plus. And he's constantly, upping the standards here. And we ought to be doing that. But the other thing that I think is absolutely amazing and fascinating about this is that he doesn't see that as unattainable. His words are not like, that's too much. I don't think I'm ever going to get there. It's no, boys, I'm pressing up. I'm going to hit that. Like, maybe not this week, but I'm going to eventually hit that point, and that's where I want to be. That's where I'm trying to get to. And I think that's a huge lesson for us, to not plateau out. Because I think some of us, I want to be a Bible class teacher. And so you get there and you're just a Bible class teacher. Or maybe I want to be a deacon, or I want to be an elder, or I want to be a preacher. And it's like we set these targets that younger, immature me thinks are lofty goals. But what happens once you get there? Then what? Like, are you still looking up to say, hey, I want to go, this is guy. I mean, rightfully, when we talk about Paul here, I mean, we had 2 dozen churches that he started at this point. I mean, countless numbers that he's baptized or influenced, or, taken the gospel to places that it had never been taught, never been spoken of. And he's
the preaching tree at this point, Timothy, right. Titus, Luke.
Yeah. All the boys off of that. And to think that he's still saying, I got work to do. How many of us would sit on house arrest and draw our preaching tree and say, boys, I'm a pretty good old boy, instead of, still building? I think that's impressive. But here's another thing I want to circle back to. And I think this is so cool. We remember Paul's story, right? How Paul was on the opposite side. Saul of Tarsus was persecuting Jesus. And I think we've got to keep that in mind when we listen to how he says that I'm not already perfect, but I press on to make it my own. Why? Because Christ Jesus made me his own. How about that?
That's good language, man.
How about from the guy that was a scoundrel and a scumbag and was on his way to Damascus with papers? How about that guy saying, but he made me his, that I'm his. And that's my motivation for everything. And I think all of us, man, we ought to talk like that. I mean, I don't know why we don't. We ought to talk like that and say, I'm doing this because he made me his own, because I belong to him. That's why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this to be a better dude. I'm not doing this to be a better preacher. I'm not doing this to pad my resume. I'm doing this because he made me his, and I belong to him. And
that's really good.
Special.
And I would also say that's why we don't plateau, is because it's not on us, right? And so if, Paul's abilities would have plateaued a long time ago, according to him, he would self-describe not eloquent and had a lot of,
maybe a skosh modest there. I mean, with his schooling, he was an above average speaker.
Listen, if you want to try to impugn the character of Paul, that's on you. I'm going to take him at his word and say that anyway, for him why did he think that he could get to that level? To your point, which I think is an excellent point, is that he believed he could get there. Why? Not because he knew that he could keep every day, achieve something else on his own to get a step closer, but that Jesus kept working on him. He kept getting more like Jesus. It was a righteousness not of his own in verse 9. And because of that, he did believe that he could get there, that Jesus could get him there. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it. That Jesus was going to drag him along to that level, and we better all get dragged to that level, right? I mean, that's be holy because I am holy. That is not an optional holiness. That's a holiness that's going to be required of us in eternity, right? And so how are we? We're all going to have to get drugged there by Jesus. We're all going to now. Fortunately, again, we don't have to figure out all the algorithms to get there. Jesus got to keep working on us. But I love the point. He thought he could get even to that bar.
And I think part of
because Jesus made him his own.
Right. And part of what we got to keep in mind too is to do what we see in Paul and the Apostle Paul, we've got to do what the Apostle Paul does, right? He constantly examined himself to see whether or not he was in the faith. He buffeted his body daily. He had the Romans 7 argument with himself, right? I've talked to brethren all the time about, about that balance between grace and self-worth and all that. And my comment usually is, if you're regularly having that Romans 7 argument with yourself, you're on the right track. If you've never had that Romans 7 argument with yourself, you're in trouble. And that don't know what I mean, it's I do the things that I know I shouldn't do, and I don't do the things that I know I should do, oh wretched man that I am. But thanks be to God that Christ is still working in me, and I'm not a finished product.
Well, I'm not sure that's not exactly the point he's making in verse 15. That those who are mature think this way, that they are continuing to press on, that they're having the Romans 7 argument with themselves, that they know they haven't achieved the correct level yet. Let those who are mature think this way. I almost, to paraphrase what he's saying there, if you think you have achieved that, that's immaturity.
Right.
If you think that, if you believe that you're mature, that's immaturity. I think that's maybe a paraphrase of what he's saying there.
Right. So let me, because that was my question I texted you. So how do we define maturity? How do I know that I'm mature? And that's in some ways a loaded question that I'm not sure I should be asking you if I know whether or not I should.
I know too much to answer.
But how do we get there? What's the bar? What's the litmus test? How do we rank this?
Well, I think that what we just said is not unimportant. Is that I think I used this phrase earlier because I read it. It's not my phrase, but that Paul knew that there was a divine dissatisfaction with where his life even was at that moment. That he knew that he could and needed to keep pressing forward. That he hadn't achieved it yet. That there was more that he needed to do, achieve, and be through Jesus. So I think that part of maturity is understanding grace, that we can come to Jesus as we are, but we can't stay as we are. That even Paul knew that where he was not insecure in his salvation, and yet he had a divine dissatisfaction that he wanted to continue to do more. That seems pretty mature.
So, keep firing at you. So, are you telling me
when do you get to play?
So are you telling me that maturity as a Christian also equals ambition?
Ambition. So how do you define ambition?
You can't stay where you're at, right? That you've got some ambition, you've got to grow, you've got to be better. So part of our maturity is understanding that it's not okay to be where we're at. I've got to be better. I've got to grow more. I've got to do more. I've got to,
so I think
I struggle with defining that, but yes.
Yeah. So the only thing that I might just parse out of that to say differently is I can't be okay where I'm at always, right? Like where I'm at today is I need to have confidence in where I'm at today. Because of grace, right? Because I think Jesus makes up the gap. And I'm confident where I am because of grace. But I can't be here 3 months from now. I can't be here 6 months from now. And so understanding that it can't be okay to be stagnant. And if that's ambition, if that Christian type of ambition, then I'm all for it. I think that is necessary. I think that is maturity. Isn't that what Paul had here, right? Defined in that way, that he was pressing on That's a great phraseology there, right? He was pressing on toward the mark of the prize of the upward call. I think the answer to that is yes, but I'm interested to hear your comment.
So this is also, and I think it's yes, but this is the place where guys like you and me get super uncomfortable. And this is why you and I get super uncomfortable, because we're numbers people, right? Everything in your world and my world, professionally speaking here,
Yes.
you
Yes.
have a numerical measurement behind it, right? So if
Sure.
you're, when you're sitting down at corporate, you say, boys, are we better this year than last year? Well, what'd we grow by, right? Did our margin grow? Did our sales number grow? Did our revenue number grow? We have to have a new number that says we're better this year than last year, right?
Sure.
In my world too, in financial planning, if we're on pace to our plan, your financial plan is we got to grow, and typically it's in dollars. So we've either made more money or we've cut down money, but we've had a net gain to your net worth year over year if we're doing our job right. So here's where it gets sticky. None of these things are numerical based, right? It's not that, and maybe to some people it is, depending on where you're at on this curve, right? Maybe if you're struggling to come to services and next year you make it to 80% of the services when this year only made it to 60%, maybe that's a growth pattern. But as we mature, it gets harder and harder to put our finger on and write down and say, I was here and now I'm here. So
Yeah.
the question then is, how do we quantify this? How do I know that I'm growing?
Yeah, I think it speaks to a bigger issue, is that Grace is not very good at math, and I think that's on purpose, right? And we could reference a lot of scripture with that. 70 times 7, might be one of those answers, that it wasn't a achievement of a number. It was an idea, right? It was an issue of the heart. When the laborers in the vineyard, the ones that came at the 11th hour and got paid the same, you and I, as financial wonks, don't like the math there. The economics there is terrible. And Grace isn't very good at math. And so that's why it is very hard. We want to have a benchmark, right? We want to say, well, I'm at 7 and I need to get a 9. But I'm persuaded that it's not that easy. That the 2 Corinthians 13 idea that you noted earlier of test yourself, see whether you're in the faith, is not a out of 100 test. That you can't fill in the Scantron and send it in and see what grade you made. That it's not that simple. That it is a subjective understanding of our own heart. And so that to your point, that makes it more difficult. Wouldn't it be easier if we just, to take a blood test and see what our number was and how much we had to improve to get to the mark of the prize of the high calling here? But because it's subjective and because it's our heart, math doesn't cut it.
Right. It'd be so much easier and better if we had a soul score, right? Your soul's operating at 25% capacity now, and we're trying to get to 30 by the end of the year.
Like a credit score. Yeah, exactly.
We're just trying to get better.
Here's
the other thing that's more frightening to me about it. You talk about benchmarks. You know what the benchmark is? Benchmark's me. That's what God looks at, where I should be growing on my own growth curve. He's not comparing me to you. He's not saying, well, at this stage, Michael Ray was here, and at this stage, you're here. No, he's saying, look, I know you. I know your potential. I know your heart. I know what you should be putting in. And at this date on the calendar, you should be here on the curve. And you're here. So, that's even to me, the scarier thing is I'm not benchmarked. Like, I don't want to get in the weeds for friends that are listening. And this is the part of the conversation where nerds that love math, like, really lose people. But, you and I, when we think about this, if I can hit the middle of the bell curve in most everything, it's all right. I know I can find 50% of the population that's worse than I am, right? If I can just somehow hit that curve slightly to the right of it, if I can get a 75 or better on the test, I know I'm doing better than most of the field. And that's a comfortable place to be when you're plotting out statistics. But when you say it's not a bell curve, I'm not betting on a bunch of people underperforming, right? I'm on me, and where should I be? And that, I think, drills to the deeper question of self-examination, right? You've got to know where you are at any given time to know where you have been and where you're going, which I that's the hard, I think, difficult part of this.
And that's the reason, right, that Paul says when they compare themselves amongst themselves, they're not wise, because our what was it? There's a great C.S. Lewis quote in there somewhere that men only see the end results, but God sees the raw material, right? He knows what our capacities are and what we are achieving compared to our capacities. So that's alarming thing number one. Number two is the real benchmark is not only how I'm doing against my capacity, but how I'm doing against the benchmark, right? And that's what Paul said, or I think that's what he's saying, that the mark of becoming like Jesus in his death. And when we compare ourselves against that benchmark, that's when we just got to go pray and ask for grace. And that I think that maybe is the maturity that when I have that comprehension, which it appears that Paul had, was having here, even when he wrote to these brethren in Philippi, that comprehension of where he was against that benchmark, that Romans 7 moment, was kept him pressing on.
Like so, I think your question was next, right down into 17 and 18. Was that you next?
Yeah, we both had questions, I think, down in verse 18, 19, when Paul is talking about in the last kind of, if you want to say, paragraph of this chapter, as these chapters are divided, talking about those who are walking toward destruction. Their end is destruction, verse 19. And Paul says in 18, he writes about these guys with tears. But the phrase I found interesting, and I wanted to kind of parse through with you, is that, at least in English Standard, their end is destruction, their God is their belly. So clearly they're focused on material, earthly, selfish things. But the phrase is, they glory in their shame. They glory in their shame. And clearly, or I think I'm handling this correctly, clearly in this context, he's referring to people who are at least ostensibly religious, right? There are people who are calling themselves teachers, it appears to me, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ, but or maybe I'm handling that incorrectly. I had a false teacher's notion there, but maybe I'm handling that incorrectly. Is that how you read that?
I think that could be part of it. But I think that when we look at something like this, the last part of that is just as important. That their end is their destruction, their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame, with mindset on earthly things. So when we quantify things in earthly ways, right, back to kind of what he says to them in Corinth, right, that when to the world, what we do as Christians is foolishness. It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. But to those that are Christians, what we do is everything, right? And so when you start trying to quantify things by earthly terms, then what we would see as shame as a Christian, they would glory in, right? So, whether that be, and we can throw a bunch of things out there. So, I'm convinced, and I may be completely wrong on this, but I'm convinced today that the issue in Corinth about their wisdom, or their thought wisdom, was their extension of grace into sin, right? That what I think happened in Corinth is they thought they were so wise and they were so good at parsing out grace that they allowed sin to be committed even in their presence, and even the awful sins that are talked about there that they were living with, and that they were so mature and so godly that they could extend grace even to active sin. And it was just complete foolishness, right? I'm convinced that's kind of where Corinth got. And we can take some biblical principles and twist them into worldly ways and start quantifying them in worldly things. And that's all that stuff ends up being shameful. So one of the things that I think about in here is, when we're talking about preachers or teachers, is, are you a great teacher because maybe you're commanding a high salary? Is that where they're at? That, look, they're glorying in, it costs you 10,000 talents to sit at my feet and hear about Jesus. And think about, the gospel freely given and all those principles that Jesus talks about. Their glory is, that's the audience that I command, is something like that. So that they would glory in shame in a situation like that. But we could throw a bunch of things out there in that same idea. But I think it's when you're trying to define, and even today, that if you're ranking one preacher against another, and it's the number of baptisms that they had in the last year, right? That you're glorying in that doesn't have anything to do with that guy. And if that guy is any kind of a guy as a Christian, he's denying anything to do with the baptisms, right? But when we're keeping score, when we're record keeping, when I'm stack ranking myself, you're using worldly terms.
Yeah, I just, it seems like we could sit here and come up with a lot of examples of people who the things that Jesus would have found shameful are the exact things that they glory in. And it seems like there's any number of examples there. I think you hit on one, and monetary things come to mind pretty easily there, that, the size of the audience and the size of the arena and the size of the book deal, I'm persuaded Jesus would have been ashamed of those things, and that when we're, but try to, obviously those are issues, but what about for me? What could I be doing that I'm taking glory in that Jesus would be ashamed of? And that caused a little reflection there. I think, what am I glorying in? And is that, anyway, it's probably a relatively common, not like that's some kind of super wise thought or super wise idea, but it did give me a moment of pause to think about, is what I am glorying in, could this be written about me, that they glory in their shame? Anyway, I thought that was a very well put thought.
That's something, I guess, for me, my thought always is, and where I stop is anytime that in my own mind I'm trying to keep score. If I ever find myself trying to keep score, even against my own self, right? If I'm trying to look at how I'm doing, if I'm keeping score and I can put a numerical value on something, that's usually when I've got to say, hold on, man, you've gone off base. Like, we've got off the reservation. We've got to stop, because those things don't have anything to do with anything. And I think that's difficulty. And for me anyway, that, because I'm a numbers guy, right? I think everybody has to figure it out for themselves. But for me, it's when I'm assigning numerical values is when I got to hit the pause button.
Yeah. To what you said about baptisms, and again, don't want to focus too much on one point, because there could be many examples of this, but I think it's interesting. Paul couldn't remember how many people he baptized in Corinth, right? I mean, so he was not keeping score, at least in those terms, or probably in any terms. So I completely agree with you.
And I don't know how things were with and Southside recently had it's in the middle of a preacher change, I guess, right? You've got a good guy that you and I have known for some years that's going to come and work with you all there. And I'm excited for you all to get there. But in that in-between time, we went through that last summer when my father-in-law retired. And it was interesting. I don't even know how I ended up in the middle of this, but I ended up in the middle of our search, helping out our elders with different contacts and things. But it was very interesting, the number of preachers I talked to where that was part of their resume. And I always cringed when I got those numbers. I got to XYZ church and we were 36 when I got here and we're 75 now. Like, that was me. That hurts. I struggle with that. Or, I baptized X number of people last year, and for the last 5 years, here's my running number of how many people we baptized. Just those numbers just absolutely make me cringe. And, I get it. You're trying out for a job, you're auditioning, you're, interviewing. I don't know, like with a preacher, all those terms feel bad to me, but whatever you're doing, you're trying to put your best foot forward. And I think when you're struggling to say, why should you talk to me? Why should I be a candidate for your open position? I think maybe sometimes that feels safe to try to go to those, to those numbers, but it always, goodness, it makes me cringe.
Yeah, I can definitely see being squishy about that. Also, to 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 try to be graceful, I think I understand the intent. To your point,
Yes.
right? Is if I'm there's a whole tangent here on our preacher that I'm not qualified to do, but I want you to know that I have been diligent in the word of the Lord, right? I mean, that's what you're trying to convey. And how do you convey that when
Right.
grace doesn't keep score?
Right.
How do
Yeah.
you convey that? It's really hard to do. So I sympathize with those who are trying to convey that. But I hear you. It gets a little squishy.
Yeah, well, especially, I've been in sales management for 20 years now, and that's what I want to hear. When you walk in my office and you want to be a financial planner with our bank, I want numbers. Like, what are your current assets under management? What were they last year? How many new clients have you brought in? All I care about. I don't care if you come in and tell me you're a nice guy. Like, hey, I'm a nice guy and I'm going to try hard. Like, I don't. None of that matters to me as a sales manager. Now, when I'm talking to preachers, it's almost the opposite. Like, all I want you to do is come in and tell me, like, I'm really going to come in here and work hard and I'm going to try to meet some people. Like, all of the things that I would throw you out of my office if we're at the bank for, like, that's what I want to hear. And it's I don't know, it's uncomfortable. And I'm thankful that I'm not an elder and I'm not hiring preachers. Because I'm terrible.
That's why we have to muddle through these conversations so that we hopefully can get there. So here's the last thing I'll say about chapter 3, and probably a good place to end it is verse 20. And this, I think, speaks to the broader context of the whole book. And we talked about what would it mean for the brethren in Philippi. Is when Paul says our citizenship is in heaven. I am just I'm bowled over by that phrase in the context of where this letter was written, because the Philippians understood the concept of being a citizen of a place where they were not residing.
Mm-hmm.
They understood that they were citizens of Rome and they were 1,000 miles away from Rome. That they understood the concept of looking like a Roman, talking like a Roman, dressing like a Roman, acting like a Roman, having the privileges of a Roman, but not being in Rome. And so that concept of talking like your citizenship's in heaven, walking like your citizenship's in heaven, dressing metaphorically like your citizenship is in heaven, having the privileges of someone whose citizenship is in heaven and not being in heaven yet. I just think that is profound. I think Paul nailed it there in trying to communicate what being a Christian was all about to this specific audience.
So I've thought a lot about this point because that's and I'm glad you brought it up. That's kind of where I thought we would end up tonight. And I tried to find historically something that we could relate to, and I can't, right? Because this is a colonialist idea, right?
Yes.
So the closest thing we could go to maybe, and again, we're so far removed from it, but the closest thing we could go to is, those folks that were in the original 13 colonies that were still part of Britain as World Empire Britain and thought about it as their part of World Empire Britain. And
Loyalist.
remember, there's out of those loyalists, right? There were several that were kind of getting out of Dodge to make a good start, right? That maybe had messed some things up in jolly old England, and were coming over to the States to try to start over. Came over maybe as an indentured servant or came over and borrowed some money, and were trying to make good for things they had back there. But they were very loyal back to the crown, and I think part of what we can miss from history is that, there were, it wasn't quite a civil war at the Revolutionary War, but there were a lot of British patriots, a lot of loyalists there. It wasn't like the population of the 13 colonies all turned around and started fighting against Britain across the ocean. There were several within these colonies, within these cities that struggled with that said, no, I'm part of Britain. We may be in, Plymouth Rock, but we're Brits. And
Yep.
So I think that's the closest thing anyway that I could come up with that same idea. But it's that idea that we will, under every circumstance, I think, fight for and protect that citizenship too. So that's the other thing I was wanting to drive home, is that I think that we ought to in our frame of mind and our speech and our actions, be very defensive of that citizenship above everything else. These Christians here in Philippi, all the citizens of Philippi, were citizens of Rome even before Philippi. So they would have told you that they're Romans, not Philippians.
Well, that's what they did say, right? We
Right.
talked about this earlier in Acts 16. These things are, when they first accused Paul, they said these things are not legal for us as Romans to practice, not as Philippians, not as Macedonians, as Romans.
Correct. And I think that's significant too. How many in the States think of themselves as citizens of the kingdom first and Americans second? I mean, how many push their God-given rights under the Constitution before they yield said rights as a Christian under Romans 14?
Yes.
We could get off the rails in this, and I don't intend it to be that way, but it's food for thought as we close of how do we make decisions? Do we make them as if we are a citizen of the kingdom first and an American second, or a Canadian or a Brit or a whatever, but is our citizenship first and foremost to the kingdom, and then secondly to wherever we choose to reside?
And this is also imperfect. The other parallel that comes to mind with that example, not as much about the citizenship, but with some of the things that go along with it, is Chinatown. So you got a group of, if you've been to New York and you've been to Chinatown, or any of those similar ethnic kind of enclaves, it is a place in a foreign land that is devoted to holding the traditions and the feel of a different place. That it feels, the intent is for this to be China or Vietnam or Thailand or whatever, even though we're in New York or whatever, that the way we dress, the way we eat, the way we talk, that we're gonna hold those. We want, when somebody's here, we want them to feel like they know that they're in China or
feel like
feel like you're home, exactly. And so when somebody walks into our assembly or walks into our home, we want to feel like they're part of a place that's not just in Kentucky, right? That's not just, but there is a feel, there is an intent for this to be part of a different place. So anyway, that I would offer that imperfect parallel also is one I've thought about when our citizenship's in heaven.
And I think that is special. Here's my, we keep saying we're going to wrap up. I think we've been sitting down for 6 minutes now, but here's my last ditch commercial.
Grace doesn't keep score.
Right. If you don't regularly, as you travel, find brethren to worship with, you're missing out. You're just absolutely missing out.
100%.
Some of the best experiences I've had is, to Michael's point, walking into a group that we don't know and being at home. Michael and I share several experiences of this, but the one that I think of is that congregation in South Carolina, right? That we walked in on, and we're absolutely fish out of water, culturally, ethnically, whatever. And we were welcomed right in. Like we were home, like we'd always been there. Like, we weren't visitors, that we just were, that was our pew. So when you have those type of experiences, to me, it's incredible. You find out how small the world is, because typically you could find connections where you're
Always
1 or 2 or 3 degrees off.
Correct.
So do that, please, please, please. If you don't regularly do that, absolutely, I encourage you to do that. I think it will help your faith and help kind of renew your faith in others, that there's people in South Carolina and Florida and North Dakota that are fighting the same good fight you are, and there's good people everywhere. And I always think that that's amazing. We leave those places, my family, every time we travel, we leave those places ecstatic that we stop by.
And if somebody asks you to lunch, go. That's my other advice. 100% go every time. You will never regret that acceptance. Whatever the offer is, go. It'll be, anyway, that's unsolicited advice.
And here's the thing, like for somebody that lives life scripted, like, I'm schedule guy, build it in. Like build in the fact that you're going to go visit XYZ congregation on your way home and you're going to stay for lunch. Just build it into the schedule. You will 100 times out of 100 not be disappointed. It'll be good. And, worst case scenario, you've got an outstanding story, because we've met some characters along the road that were outstanding stories, great people, but just different from what we are. So we've had some good stories there.
Amen.
Well, we're going to cut it off tonight. Thank you for tuning in, still being with us. I think we're getting a little bit better. We're somewhere around 45 or 50 minutes tonight, but there's so much here and so much depth in Philippians. So thank you for staying along for the ride. Lord willing, we will pick up Thursday night and Philippians chapter 4, and we'll probably spend a couple of lessons there, just looking at my notes and my outline so far. So thank you for staying along for the ride. Tuning back in with us again, and please share this, comment, do everything you can to be involved, and we'll do everything we can to answer your questions and keep you involved as well. Thank you all for tuning in.
Enjoy, brother.